This place cost me my last dollar.
Everyone says that farm is cursed.
Then why is that silo built like a fortress?
Kicked onto the curb on his 18th birthday, Cortland Garcia had nothing but a trash bag of clothes and a single dollar bill. That exact dollar bought him a rotting, forgotten farm at a county auction. But the abandoned property harbored a multi-million-dollar secret buried right beneath its crumbling silo. Rain soaked the cheap cardboard box holding everything Cortland Garcia owned in the world. It was exactly 12:01 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday morning in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania. He had just turned 18, and milestone most teenagers celebrate with cake, friends, and late-night driving. For Cortland, turning 18 meant a sudden, violent thrust into homelessness. His stepfather, Douglas Trent, stood in the doorway of their cramped, peeling apartment, an unlit cigarette dangling from his sneering lips. Douglas had waited for the precise legal minute Cortland was no longer a minor. He hadn't wanted Cortland around since Cortland's mother passed away 3 years prior, leaving Douglas with a child he resented and a life insurance policy he had already squandered at the dog track. "You're an adult now, kid," Douglas grunted, his voice thick with malice. He kicked a stray sneaker out the door, watching it splash into a muddy puddle. "My legal obligation to house you expired 60 seconds ago. Don't come knocking when you get hungry." The heavy wooden door slammed shut, the deadbolt clicking with absolute finality. Cortland stood on the crumbling concrete landing, the freezing October rain plastering his thin jacket to his skin. He didn't cry. The grief and shock had been replaced by a hollow, gnawing panic. He reached into his damp jeans pocket. His fingers brushed against a pocket knife, his mother's silver locket, and a single crumpled $1 bill. That was his entire net worth. For hours, Cortland walked the slick, dark streets of Willow Creek. The town was a decaying Rust Belt relic, filled with shuttered storefronts and factories that had stopped humming decades ago. By dawn, the temperature had dropped severely, trembling uncontrollably. Cortland pushed through the glass doors of the county courthouse, not because he had business there, but because it was a public building, and the heating was turned on. He slipped into the back of a large, wood-paneled municipal room, hoping to remain unnoticed by the security guards. Dozens of people in cheap suits and sensible shoes were seated in pews, holding numbered paddles. Cortland collapsed onto a wooden bench in the very back, rubbing his frozen hands together. At the front of the room, an exhausted, balding man in a poorly fitting suit was droning on through a microphone. A banner above him read, "Willow Creek County Tax Deed and Liability Auction." The auctioneer, Gregory P. Simmons, was moving quickly through a list of foreclosed commercial properties and abandoned lots. Investors were shouting out bids in the thousands. Cortland watched, mesmerized by the sheer amount of money changing hands, while his stomach growled with violent emptiness. "All right, let's keep it moving," Gregory sighed, rubbing his temples. "Parcel 404, the old Abernathy Tract, 42 acres out on County Road 9. The land is agriculturally dead, heavily polluted with concrete slurry from the previous owner's unlicensed construction, and the main structure is completely condemned. Total liability. The county wants it off the books to avoid further environmental fines." The room was dead silent. Nobody raised a paddle. "Do I hear $1,000? Gregory asked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Silence. 500? More silence. Several investors actually laughed. "Look, folks," Gregory said, clearly exasperated. "The back taxes have been waived by the municipality. The county is bleeding money just doing the perimeter safety checks on this eyesore. I will take literally anything to transfer the liability deed today. Who will give me a single dollar just to take it off our hands?" It was meant to be a joke, a sarcastic jab at the worthless nature of the land. But in the back row, Cortland's hand shot up. His fingers were still clutching his crumpled, damp George Washington. The entire room turned to stare at the dripping wet, shivering 18-year-old boy holding up a soggy dollar bill. Gregory blinked, adjusting his glasses, assuming it was a prank. "Son, this is a legally binding auction. Are you bidding $1 for parcel 404? "Yes, sir," Cortland croaked, his voice raw from the cold. "I have $1. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few people chuckled, while others looked at the boy with a mix of pity and confusion. Gregory hesitated, looking toward the county clerk seated next to him, a stern but tired-looking woman named Beatrice Holloway. She shrugged, stamping a document. "Sold," Gregory announced, slamming his wooden gavel down. "For $1. 30 minutes later, Cortland was seated in a cramped back office, a mountain of paperwork laid out before him. Beatrice Holloway handed him a pen, her eyes scanning his drenched clothes and exhausted face. She slid a mug of warm coffee toward him. "You have no idea what you just bought, do you, sweetheart?" Beatrice asked softly. Cortland took a sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his freezing chest. I bought a farm, somewhere I can stay. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Beatrice sighed, a deeply sympathetic sound. You bought a nightmare, Cortland. Arthur Abernathy owned that land back in the 70s. He was a paranoid eccentric. He thought the government was coming for his wealth, so he ruined the topsoil building God knows what, went entirely bankrupt, and died without a penny. The property has been locked in probate and environmental disputes for 40 years. The farmhouse is missing half its roof. There's no running water, no electricity. And by signing this, you are legally responsible for any code violations. I don't have anything they can take from me, Cortland said quietly, signing the final line on the deed. It has walls, right? And a floor? Barely, Beatrice warned. It's a 10-mile walk out of town. Please, kid, be careful. Cortland took the heavy folder containing his deed. He was a landowner now. He had $0, no food, and no transportation. But he was no longer homeless. He thanked Beatrice, walked out of the warm courthouse, and turned his face toward County Road 9. He had a long walk ahead of him. The hike to parcel 404 took Cortland nearly 4 hours. The rain had finally stopped, replaced by a biting autumn wind that whipped through the barren trees, lining the remote country highway. His boots were soaked, his muscles ached with a dull, throbbing intensity, but the heavy folder tucked under his arm felt like a shield. When he finally reached the rusted, iron-wrought gates of Oakhaven Farm, his heart sank. Beatrice hadn't been exaggerating. If anything, she had underplayed the devastation. The property was a desolate wasteland of overgrown, thorny brush and cracked earth. In the distance stood the farmhouse. It was a sprawling, Victorian-style structure that looked as though it had been subjected to an artillery strike. The porch was entirely collapsed, the windows were shattered, and the right side of the roof had caved in, leaving the skeletal wooden beams exposed to the gray sky. It was a rotting monument to a forgotten era. Cortland pushed through the heavy gates, the rusted hinges screaming in the quiet afternoon. As he navigated the knee-high weeds toward the house, a rattling sound made him freeze. An old, beat-up Ford pickup truck was bouncing down the dirt road bordering the property. The truck slammed on its brakes, kicking up a cloud of wet dirt, and an older woman with sharp, weathered features and a thick wool coat stepped out. "Hey, you're trespassing," she barked, her voice raspy like sandpaper. "County says nobody is allowed on this cursed dirt." Cortland walked toward the fence line, holding up his manila folder. "I'm not trespassing, ma'am. I own it. I bought it at the auction this morning." The woman paused, squinting at him through a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. She looked him up and down the wet clothes, the shivering frame, the sheer youth of his face. Her hostile demeanor instantly melted into a grim sort of pity. "Lord have mercy. The county finally found a sucker," she muttered, walking up to the fence. "I'm Adele Finch. I own the dairy farm 2 miles down the road. You actually bought Arthur's Folly?" "Cortland Garcia," he replied, shivering. "And yes, for $1. Adele shook her head, leaning against the wooden fence post. $1 is too much. You're just a kid. Arthur Abernathy went completely off the deep end before you were even born. He inherited a massive fortune from his family's industrial business, but he became convinced the banks were going to collapse and the government was going to seize civilian assets. He spent millions tearing up this land, pouring military-grade concrete, hoarding supplies. He went broke paying contractors and died of a heart attack in that ruined house. The bank tried to sell the land, but the environmental inspectors found out he dumped hundreds of gallons of chemical sealants into the ground to waterproof whatever he was building. It's a dead zone. I just need a place to sleep, Cortland admitted, looking back at the sagging house. Adele sighed, reaching into her truck and pulling out a heavy woolen blanket and a sealed thermos. She handed them over the fence. "Soup and a blanket. Don't freeze to death, Cortland Garcia. But I'm warning you, don't go poking around in the dark. The ground out here isn't stable." Cortland thanked her profusely, the warmth of the thermos practically burning his freezing fingers. He watched her drive away before finally approaching the farmhouse. The inside was exactly as terrifying as the outside. The air smelled of wet rot, raccoon droppings, and decades of neglect. He found a small parlor on the ground floor, where the ceiling was still intact. He spent the next 3 hours clearing out debris, broken glass, and rusted furniture, using a makeshift broom made of pine branches. As dusk fell, he drank the rich, hot tomato soup Adele had given him, wrapped himself in the heavy blanket, and huddled in the corner. The wind howled through the broken windows like a chorus of ghosts. It was the hardest night of his life, but as he closed his eyes, he repeated a single mantra: "This is mine. Nobody can kick me out." When the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, pale beams of light across the ruined parlor, Cortland woke up feeling stiff but alive. He stepped out onto the overgrown back lawn to survey his kingdom. That was when he saw it properly for the first time. Behind the farmhouse, half swallowed by aggressive ivy and dead blackberry bushes, stood a massive silo. But it was entirely wrong. Cortland had seen farm silos before. They were usually made of corrugated tin, wood, or brick, built tall to store grain, with a chute running down the side for easy access. This silo was different. It was relatively short, maybe only 3 stories high, but it was incredibly thick. It was constructed entirely out of smooth, reinforced concrete, devoid of any windows, seams, or grain chutes. It looked less like an agricultural structure and more like a Cold War radar station. Intrigued, Cortland hacked his way through the thick brush using his pocket knife until he reached the base. There was only one entrance. It wasn't a standard wooden barn door. It was a massive industrial steel blast door, the kind used in bank vaults or military bunkers. The edges were welded tight, but the most imposing feature was the locking mechanism. Thick, heavy chains wrapped around the handles, secured by an enormous, titanium-reinforced padlock that looked heavily customized. Why would a bankrupt farmer build a military-grade bunker and lock it from the outside? Cortland pressed his ear against the cold steel. There was no sound, just the deafening silence of 40 years of abandonment. But as he ran his hand along the bottom edge of the door, he noticed something strange. The steel wasn't rusted at the bottom. In fact, a faint, continuous current of air was pushing through a tiny crack between the door and the concrete frame. It wasn't the damp, earthy smell of a root cellar. It was perfectly dry, distinctly sterile air. There was climate control running beneath the silo, and if there was climate control, there was power. And if there was power after 40 years, Arthur Abernathy had built something far more complex than a simple doomsday bunker. Cortland stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had bought a liability for $1, but looking at the impenetrable steel door, he realized he might have just bought the Abernathy legacy. He just had to find a way inside. For the next 2 days, Cortland became a ghost haunting his own property. He survived on the remaining soup, wild apples he found near the fence line, and sheer, unadulterated adrenaline. His obsession with the silo consumed him. He systematically tore through the ruined farmhouse, searching for keys, combinations, or tools. On the second afternoon, beneath a rotten floorboard in the former master bedroom, he found a rusted metal lockbox. Inside was a leather-bound journal belonging to Arthur Abernathy, dated 1978. The pages were brittle, heavily water-damaged, and filled with the erratic, sprawling handwriting of a man slowly losing his grip on reality. Cortland carefully turned the pages. Most of it was paranoid ramblings about inflation, federal overreach, and the impending collapse of the global banking system. But near the end, a few underlined passages caught Cortland's eye. "The wealth cannot sit in their vaults. They will seize it when the panic starts. I have moved the collection. The legacy is sealed in the deep concrete. Let the banks take the house. Let the county take the dirt. They will never breach the silo. It is climate sealed. It is safe from the rot of the world." Before Cortland could process the magnitude of the journal, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the silence of the farm. Cortland rushed to the shattered window. A sleek, midnight black Mercedes G-Wagon was bouncing aggressively down his ruined driveway, its polished exterior a stark contrast to the mud and decay of Oakhaven. The SUV parked near the collapsed porch, and a man stepped out. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and expensive leather loafers that immediately sank into the wet soil. He looked around with an expression of deep disgust before his eyes locked onto Cortland, who was standing in the doorway holding the journal. "You must be the new owner," the man called out, flashing a perfectly white, predatory smile. He walked forward, completely ignoring the mud, ruining his shoes. "Horace Perry. I represent Apex Agricultural Development. Do you have a minute?" Cortland didn't trust him instantly. A man in a $3,000 suit didn't drive out to a condemned dirt farm just to say hello. "I'm Cortland. What do you want?" Horace stopped a few feet away, pulling a silver, sleek briefcase from his side. "I'll get right to the point, Cortland. You're young, and you clearly got duped at the county auction. Apex is looking to buy up contiguous acreage in this area for a massive solar panel farm. This land is useless for crops, but it gets decent sunlight. We're willing to take this massive liability off your hands. I have a cashier's check right here for $5,000. You sign the deed over, and you walk away 5 grand richer. Not a bad return on investment for a dollar, right? $5,000. To an 18-year-old who had slept on a freezing floor for 2 days, it was a king's ransom. It meant a warm apartment, new clothes, and hot food. Cortland felt his hand twitch toward the briefcase. But then he noticed Horace's eyes. The developer was smiling at Cortland, but his gaze kept darting over Cortland's shoulder, specifically toward the heavy concrete outline of the silo towering in the back. Horace was sweating, despite the cold wind. He was eager. Too eager. "You want to build a solar farm," Cortland said slowly, testing the waters. "On 40 acres of land blocked by massive, overgrown oak trees?" Horace's smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. "We have heavy machinery. We clear the trees." "And the environmental fines?" Cortland countered, remembering what Beatrice and Adele had told him. "The ground is saturated with chemical sealants. The county won't allow commercial development here." Horace's polite facade began to crack, revealing the ruthless corporate shark beneath. "Listen to me, kid. You're out of your depth. You have zero capital to bring this property up to code. I know the county inspectors. By Friday, they are going to slap you with a mandatory demolition order for this farmhouse. If you can't afford the demo, which costs about 40 grand, they will seize the land and hit you with civil penalties that will ruin your credit for the rest of your life. Take the 5 grand. Walk away." Cortland stood his ground, clutching Arthur's journal tightly against his side. "If the land is going to be seized by the county on Friday, why would you pay me $5,000 for it today?" Horace's eyes went completely cold. The fake smile vanished. "Because the county auction was a clerical error, you little punk. My firm was supposed to be notified when parcel 404 hit the docket. You slipped in. I'm offering you the easy way out. I will offer 10,000 right now." "No," Cortland said firmly. "You're making a massive mistake," Horace snarled, stepping closer, his imposing frame trying to physically intimidate the teenager. "You think you found something special? You have 3 days before I call my friends in zoning and have you dragged off this dirt by the sheriff." "Get off my property," Cortland said, his voice surprisingly steady. Horace stared at him for a long, venomous moment. Then he turned on his heel, marched back to his G-Wagon, and slammed the door. The SUV tore out of the driveway, kicking up a massive spray of mud. Cortland watched him leave, his heart hammering in his throat. Horace didn't care about solar panels. Horace knew what was in the silo, and he had just confirmed that Cortland was on a ticking clock. He had 3 days before the legal loopholes closed in and the county took his land back. He didn't have time to be careful anymore. He needed brute force. Cortland sprinted the 2 miles down the road to Adele Finch's dairy farm. He found her in the barn, milking cows. Breathless, he explained about the locked silo, the strange sterile air, and the visit from Horace Perry. Adele's eyes narrowed. "Horace Perry is a vulture. He buys up distressed properties, liquidates any hidden assets, and leaves the land to rot. If he's sniffing around Arthur's silo, there's something in there worth stealing." She wiped her hands on a rag and looked at Cortland. "What do you need?" "I need to cut through a titanium-reinforced padlock and 2 inches of industrial steel chain," Cortland said. "And I have exactly $0 to rent equipment." Adele grinned, a fierce, rebellious spark in her eyes. "Boy, you just bought yourself a friend." By nightfall, Cortland was standing in front of the massive steel door of the silo. Next to him sat a heavy-duty portable gas generator, rumbling loudly into the night air. Connected to it by a thick yellow extension cord was a massive industrial-grade angle grinder equipped with a diamond-tipped cutting wheel, courtesy of Adele's machine shop. Cortland put on the heavy leather welding gloves and the protective face shield Adele had lent him. He fired up the grinder. The tool roared to life, vibrating violently in his hands. He pressed the spinning diamond blade against the thick chain wrapped around the silo's locking mechanism. A spectacular fountain of bright orange sparks erupted into the darkness, illuminating the imposing concrete structure. The noise was deafening, a high-pitched scream of metal grinding against metal. It was agonizing work. The padlock and chains were designed to withstand heavy machinery. Minutes turned into hours. Cortland's arms screamed with fatigue, the heavy grinder threatening to slip from his exhausted grip. The blade ground down slowly, millimeter by excruciating millimeter. He had to stop every 20 minutes to let the metal cool, terrified that the heat would warp the locking mechanism and jam it permanently. At 2 a.m., the first blade shattered. Shards of abrasive disc exploded outward, pinging sharply off Cortland's face shield. He staggered back, breathing heavily, soaked in sweat despite the freezing temperature. He swapped the blade out for a fresh one with trembling hands and went back to work. He thought of his stepfather throwing his belongings into the rain. He thought of Horace Perry's arrogant, threatening smile. He pressed the grinder into the metal with a primal roar. At 3:47 a.m., with a sharp, echoing crack, the titanium padlock finally gave way. The heavy chain slithered off the handles, crashing heavily to the concrete floor. Cortland dropped the grinder. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely make a fist. He reached out and grabbed the heavy steel wheel that acted as the door's handle. He braced his boots against the concrete frame and pulled with every ounce of strength he had left. The hinges groaned, a deep, metallic screech that had been silent for 4 decades. The thick blast door swung outward. A powerful gust of stale, perfectly dry air rushed out, hitting Cortland in the face. He grabbed his high-powered flashlight and aimed it into the darkness. There was no grain, there was no dirt. Instead, a pristine, white-tiled stairwell spiraled downward into the earth, going much deeper than a standard basement. It was immaculately clean, devoid of a single cobweb or speck of dust. Cortland swallowed hard, his pulse roaring in his ears. He stepped over the threshold and began his descent. The stairs wound down for what felt like 3 stories. The air grew cooler but remained aggressively dry. At the bottom of the stairwell, Cortland reached a second door. This one wasn't locked. It was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, stepping into a cavernous subterranean space that seemed to stretch out endlessly beneath the entire footprint of the farm above. Cortland clicked his flashlight to its highest setting and swept the beam across the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. His knees actually buckled. "Oh my God," Cortland whispered into the void. The flashlight beam reflected off an ocean of polished chrome, immaculate paint, and stacked silver. He hadn't just found a bunker. He had found a billionaire's time capsule. Light flooded the subterranean cavern as Cortland swept his heavy-duty flashlight side to side, revealing a space that rivaled an aircraft hangar. Arthur Abernathy had not just built a shelter. He had engineered a preservation chamber for the wealth he believed the world was going to steal. Row upon row of immaculate museum-quality classic cars sat perfectly spaced on the polished concrete floor. They were covered in sheer, breathable plastic tarps, but Cortland could see the iconic silhouettes. He walked forward, his boots clicking, echoing loudly, and pulled a tarp off the nearest vehicle. It was a pristine, candy apple red, 1967 Shelby, 427 Cobra. Next to it sat a 1969 Ford Mustang Boss, 429 in midnight black, the tires still retaining their factory gloss. There were easily 20 vehicles down here, an automotive collection easily worth tens of millions on its own. Beyond the cars, the bunker transitioned into a secure storage area. Stacked tightly on heavy-duty steel pallets were dozens of wooden crates, heavily bound in iron straps. Cortland approached one that had split slightly along the wood grain due to age. He shined his light into the crack and gasped. Solid silver bullion. The bars were stamped with Federal Reserve markings, stacked like bricks. Next to them were sealed plastic drums, labeled with chemical symbols for rare earth metals. Arthur hadn't just hoarded cash. He had converted his vast liquid fortune into hard, tangible assets that no bank collapse or hyperinflation could ever destroy. At the very back of the facility, sitting inside a glass-walled office space, was a large mahogany desk. Cortland practically sprinted to it, his chest heaving. Resting precisely in the center of the desk was a leather briefcase, identical in age to the journal he had found upstairs. He clicked the brass latches open. Inside lay a pristine, notarized envelope addressed simply, "To the eventual owner of this domain." Cortland tore the envelope open. It was a master ledger, detailing every single asset in the room, alongside a legally binding transfer of ownership. Arthur had meticulously drafted a will stating that whoever legally held the deed to Oakhaven Farm was the sole proprietor of the subterranean contents, explicitly shielding the wealth from probate or government seizure. It was bulletproof. Suddenly, a heavy, metallic thud echoed from the spiral staircase behind him. Cortland froze, the blood draining from his face. The sound reverberated again, the distinct crunch of heavy boots on the pristine tile of the stairwell. He immediately killed his flashlight, plunging the massive hangar into pitch blackness, save for the faint, ambient glow of emergency LED strips near the floorboards. Spread out, a harsh, familiar voice commanded from the bottom of the stairs. "Find the kid, secure the perimeter, and bring the extraction trucks up to the silo base." It was Horace Perry. The corporate developer hadn't waited 3 days. Realizing Cortland was onto the secret, Horace had returned in the dead of night, with a private crew of hired thugs to raid the bunker before the county could finalize the property inspections. Panic gripped Cortland's throat, suffocating and sharp. He was trapped 100 feet underground with men who clearly had no moral qualms about making an 18-year-old orphan disappear. He ducked behind the heavy steel frame of a 1954 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, clutching the leather briefcase to his chest. 3 men stepped into the cavern, sweeping the darkness with tactical, high-lumen flashlights. They wore dark tactical gear, carrying heavy crowbars and what looked like a portable blowtorch. "Perry, look at this," one of the men whistled, shining his light over the stacked silver crates. "It's all here, the Abernathy hoard. We're going to need heavy lifters to get these pallets up the chute." "Forget the silver for a minute," Horace snapped, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Find the boy. He cut the lock. He's down here. If he gets out and goes to the authorities, this whole operation is blown." Cortland crawled on his hands and knees, navigating the narrow space between the classic cars. He needed a way out, but the only exit was the spiral staircase they were currently blocking. His mind raced. Arthur Abernathy was a paranoid genius who built a fortress to keep people out. There had to be a secondary defense system. He remembered the layout of the glass office he had just been in. There was a massive electrical panel on the back wall. Moving with agonizing slowness, Cortland slid backward, keeping the vehicles between himself and the sweeping flashlight beams. He reached the glass office, slipping inside and crouching below the mahogany desk. He looked up at the electrical panel. It was an old-school industrial breaker box with heavy red levers. One of them was clearly labeled Sector Lockdown, Pressure Seal. "I hear something back there," one of the thugs yelled, his flashlight beam cutting through the glass walls of the office, illuminating Cortland's boots. "Get him!" Horace roared. Cortland sprang up, slamming his hand against the heavy red lever and pulling it down with all his body weight. Instantly, a deafening klaxon alarm began to shriek throughout the bunker. The ambient emergency lights shifted from a soft yellow to a blazing, pulsing red. But more importantly, pneumatic hydraulics hissed to life. Between the main hangar and the spiral staircase, a secondary interior blast door, which had been recessed flush into the ceiling, suddenly dropped. Horace and his men realized what was happening a second too late. They lunged for the exit, but the massive slab of reinforced titanium slammed into the floor, effectively cutting the bunker in half. Horace was trapped on the staircase side, staring through a thick, bulletproof observation window set into the metal door, while Cortland stood safely inside the main vault. Horace pounded his fists against the reinforced glass, his face contorted in absolute rage. He screamed something, but the thick door completely muffled the sound. He pointed to his men, gesturing wildly for them to use the blowtorch on the door hinges. Cortland slumped against the glass wall of the office, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was safe from physical harm, but he was permanently sealed inside a vault with no cell phone reception, no food, and limited oxygen. The air filtration system was humming, but he didn't know how long it would last. He had outsmarted the wolves, but he had locked himself in the cage. He clutched Arthur's ledger, praying that Adele Finch had heard the commotion from the highway. Sirens pierced the desolate quiet of County Road 9 just as the sun began to peek over the eastern hills. 4 Willow Creek Sheriff's Department cruisers tore through the rusted gates of the farm, their red and blue lights painting the ruined farmhouse in chaotic flashes. Sheriff Thomas Brody leaped out of his vehicle, his hand resting cautiously on his holstered sidearm. Right behind his cruiser was Adele Finch's beat-up pickup truck. She had seen the unmarked extraction trucks rolling past her dairy farm at 3 a.m. and knew immediately that Horace Perry was making his move. "They went around back," Adele shouted, pointing toward the massive concrete silo. Sheriff Brody and his deputies rushed the silo entrance. They found Horace Perry and his men frantically trying to cut through the interior blast door with a thermal lance, coughing on the thick smoke filling the stairwell. "Drop the torch and put your hands on your heads," Sheriff Brody bellowed, drawing his weapon. The deputies swarmed the narrow space, pinning the hired thugs against the white-tiled walls. Horace Perry dropped his equipment, his expensive suit ruined by soot and sweat, a look of profound defeat washing over his face as the heavy steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. Once the stairwell was cleared, Adele approached the heavy blast door and knocked firmly on the bulletproof glass window. On the other side, a pale, exhausted Cortland Garcia gave her a weak, trembling smile. It took the local fire department 3 hours to manually override the pneumatic lockdown system. When the heavy door finally retracted into the ceiling, Cortland stepped out of the billion-dollar crypt, clutching the leather briefcase tight to his chest. He collapsed into Adele's arms, breathing the fresh, morning air. The aftermath was a media frenzy that shook the entire state of Pennsylvania. When the scope of the Abernathy hoard was finally calculated, it was staggering. The classic car collection alone, appraised for over $45 million at auction. The silver bullion and rare earth metals pushed the total valuation north of $120 million. Predictably, the county government immediately attempted to seize the assets, claiming the property was sold in error and that the environmental fines voided the transaction. But Cortland was no longer a helpless, homeless teenager. Using a single silver bar he retrieved from the bunker, he hired Jonathan Reynolds, the most ruthless property and estate lawyer in Philadelphia. Armed with Arthur Abernathy's notarized ledger and the legally binding tax deed signed by the county clerk, Reynolds systematically dismantled the municipality's case in federal court. The judge ruled decisively in Cortland's favor, citing that the county had knowingly and willingly transferred the total liability, and thus, the total assets for a single dollar. Horace Perry was indicted on multiple federal charges, including armed trespassing, attempted grand larceny, and corporate espionage. The arrogant developer who had tried to buy Cortland off with $5,000 was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. 8 months after being thrown out into the freezing rain, Cortland Garcia stood on the porch of the newly restored Oak Haven farm. The rotting Victorian structure had been entirely rebuilt by master craftsmen, maintaining its historical charm but equipped with modern, off-grid technology. The land had been chemically remediated and planted with lush, green pasture. Adele Finch drove her truck up the newly paved driveway, completely ignoring the pristine landscaping as she parked on the grass. She hopped out, carrying a thermos of her famous tomato soup. Cortland smiled, walking down the steps to greet her. He had anonymously paid off the mortgage on Adele's dairy farm and established a multi-million-dollar agricultural trust in her name, ensuring she would never have to worry about a bad harvest again. Far away in a dingy, smoke-filled apartment, Douglas Trent stared blankly at his tiny television screen. The local news anchor was covering the story of the dollar billionaire, showing footage of Cortland cutting the ribbon on a massive new community center in downtown Willow Creek. Douglas dropped his cheap beer, his jaw slack, realizing he had kicked out the sole heir to the greatest hidden fortune in state history. Cortland took the thermos from Adele, taking a long sip of the hot soup as he looked out over his sprawling, beautiful estate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glass frame. Inside the frame was the exact crumpled, damp $1 bill he had handed over at the county courthouse. It was a reminder that sometimes, the lowest point in your life is just the foundation for an empire. What a journey! Cortland's transformation from an evicted teenager to a multimillionaire landowner proves that fortune favors the brave. If you were on the edge of your seat, watching him outsmart Horace Perry and secure the Abernathy legacy, hit that like button, share this incredible real-life underdog story with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable tales of hidden treasures and shocking twists. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.
Hi, my name is Windwin, the owner and manager of Coyote Frontier Hearts. After watching the video, Evicted at 18, he bought a forgotten farm for $1. What lay beneath the silo shocked everyone. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was Cortland's determination to keep moving forward, even when he had almost nothing. Instead of giving up, he took a chance and trusted himself, and that choice changed the direction of his life. It's a reminder that difficult beginnings don't always decide where our story ends. Which moment had the biggest impact on you? If you had been in Cortland's position, would you have accepted the offer to sell the farm or kept searching for answers? Sometimes it's worth looking beyond the first opportunity before making an important decision. If this story gave you something to think about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy inheritance stories filled with hidden secrets and unexpected discoveries, feel free to like the video or subscribe to Coyote Frontier Hearts for more stories like this.